managed to watch the service last week, let me repeat. There is a Remembrance Day service today at Helensburgh Parish Church. However, what I shall be doing today is a presentation of Naval chaplaincy in a war situation for this Remembrance Day. I would not in any way seek to question the dignified solemnity of the many COVID-restricted civilian and military parades that will be taking place across the United Kingdom today. But for me, it sanitises the reality of war, which is death. We don't like to talk about death. Even our language reflects this. We use lots of euphemisms for death. Passed away, passed over, no longer with us. Today I shall be talking about death, and especially the impact it has on the families and children as a result of the Falklands War. With the aid of some naval photographs and much of my own experience, I will pull no punches in regarding death. When I served as a Church of Scotland chaplain to the Royal Navy on board HMS Helensburgh during the Falklands War. The task force was a name given to the Royal Navy ships which sailed from Portsmouth to the South Atlantic to relieve the Falkland Islands from the invading Argentinians. As we sailed from Portsmouth in what is called dress ship, all the sailors and officers are on the upper deck. I recall one very young sub-lieutenant saying to a much older officer, "Sir, when do you think that we will be getting back home?" To which the officer replied, "What makes you think you'll be coming back home?" A pithy but profound statement of the reality of war. The task force consists of 2 aircraft carriers, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. If you can imagine a large circle, and inside that circle are 4 ships. The 2 aircraft carriers and 1 supply ship called the Atlantic Conveyor. A sort of floating Waitrose, and petrol station, and munitions store, all in one. We were also joined with a hospital ship, HMS Uganda, which was a civilian tour ship which had been converted into a superb floating hospital. Some background now about naval chaplaincy. Unlike our counterparts in the Army and the Royal Air Force, we have no rank. We assume the rank of a person that we are speaking to. I believe that it enables us to get nearer to all personnel, whether they are senior officers or a junior rating. Being a part of a warship is being part of a floating community. Everyone looks after everyone else. There is a very strong bond of comradeship. Part of my daily routine as we were sailing south was to get up each morning about 3 o'clock and listen to the World Service and glean any items of British news and of course the latest football results. I would then go to the bridge and directs all operations on an aircraft carrier. Up there on the ship's PA system, I would give a brief thought for the day, a short prayer, and any items of news from the radio or football results. One day I was given the heads up that it was the captain's 47th birthday anniversary. I cheerfully, tongue-in-cheek, announced to all the ship's company that we wished the captain a very happy 74th birthday. The captain took it very well. The following day, however, on daily orders, there was an entry item that the Scottish chaplain would be holding a communion service that evening in the small classroom on number 4 deck. It would be a Scottish communion, consisting of oat cakes for the bread and single malt whiskey for the wine. That meant that when I turned up, the place was overflowing, full of sailors, and it passed right out into the passageway. Touché, as the French would say. The daily announcements of birthdays soon caught on to the extent I would have to say each morning, and from the birthday bag today, it is so-and-so's birthday. Years later, after I left the Royal Navy and I was chaplain to the Royal Hospital School in Suffolk, Mary and I were shopping in Ipswich when a voice from behind said, "And from the birthday bag today." Let's get back now to the forces. As we sailed south in the Northern Hemisphere, if the weather was fine on a Sunday morning, we held a flight deck service. However, as we headed further south into the Southern Hemisphere, the weather became very cold with rough seas. At times the flight deck was only available to essential working parties, but out of bounds to everyone else, due to it being covered in ice. The Argentinians knew that if the 2 carriers were to be sunk, the whole task force would have failed, because the aircraft and helicopters which we carried were absolutely necessary for a successful prosecution of the war. Therefore, they were determined to sink at all costs the 2 carriers. The protecting ships around us, that is the carriers, used their radar to detect any attempt to get near enough to fire a missile. What was unknown at that time was that a young Argentinian pilot, several years earlier, had received advanced training in the north of Scotland at RAF Lossiemouth on how to fly very low, skimming over the very tops of the wave to avoid being detected by the ship's radar in the distance. He obviously passed on what he had learned to his colleagues. It was a highly skilled piece of flying, in that if you hit the wave, you were finished. As a brief adjunct, I just want to go off for a second. These jets, these subsonic jets, flew from the General Belgrano, which was an Argentinian aircraft carrier, which headed the tip of the spear of the attack on the British task forces. The General Belgrano was later sunk by a British nuclear submarine, Conqueror, from Faslane, which is just down the road, using conventional torpedoes. Sadly, 300 sailors were killed, and 300 families were bereft, with all the accompanying sorrow and heartbreak that invariably brings. Back to the attack now of these aircraft. At the last moments, the jets from the Belgrano would rise up, fire its exocet missiles. Now these onboard missiles had sophisticated computers which sent out radar beams which swept from side to side like a car windscreen wiper. The contact to the right was recorded, the contact to the left was recorded, and the computer directed the missile to the midpoint between the two. The pilots then banked off sharply and disappeared. Sadly, HMS Sheffield was one of the ships in the protective screen around us, was hit in the midpoint between the bow and the stern, as shown in the photograph. For whatever reason, the missile failed to impact. It did not explode. However, the missile was still full of propellant fuel, which continued to burn inside the engine and boiler room. The boiler suits provided to the engineers were very hot to wear and were replaced a few years earlier by a much cheaper, inferior polynylon material. The attack highlighted many shortcomings in war design at that time. The fire sprinkler system was unable to quickly extinguish the flames caused by the exocet strike. The intense fire from the propellant fuel burned the thick rubber cladding on the electrical cable, which dripped onto the faces of already badly injured personnel lying on the steel grating of the engine and boiler room floors. This severely exacerbated the burns already sustained due to the overalls melting. If that was not bad enough, the PVC cable in those spaces gave off toxic fumes in the fire. Hermes was informed, and we quickly dispatched helicopters to bring back the burns casualty back to our large sickbay. I hurriedly made my way back to the sickbay, a place I regularly visited each day to chat to the patients. Nothing prepared me for what I was about to see when I entered the sickbay. The floor was littered with scorched and blackened bodies lying on stretchers. Despite pain-killing injections, I shall never forget the sights and sounds of screaming men and the smell of burning flesh with melted rubber in their wounds, especially on their faces and bodies due to the melting polynylon overalls. Several were clearly dead from the injuries. The two nurses, doctors and myself wore gowns,
surgical gloves, and with very small tweezers tried as best we could to remove the hardening melted rubber from the open wounds of the survivors. Then we had to gently smear all the exposed areas with barrier cream and wrap them in cling foil. They were then transported by our helicopters to a large hospital ship, Uganda. Later that day, I retired to my cabin, locked the door, and wept. I admit it took me many years to come to terms with the horrors of the sights, sounds and smells of what I witnessed that day. What a life-changing shock to the parents, wives and children would have to endure when they learned of either their death or seeing their scarred faces and bodies for the rest of their lives. Sometimes the weather was so poor and with mountainous waves that the Argentinian pilots didn't mount any attack. However, what they did was to change tactics. They attacked very late at night when it was dark and flying much higher, therefore being open to being detected by our radars and the radars of the defending frigates and destroyers. When they did approach, the carriers, our other protective ships fired a wall of shells at them. They tried this for the duration of the storms. This intensified the stress level on the ship's company, having to incur more action stations alerts during day and night every time they attacked. Sadly, this proved too much for two of our ship's company. I got a phone call late one night to say that two of our ship's company, a young officer and a young petty officer, committed suicide by hanging themselves. We managed to lift them down and we carried them to our sickbay. In the morning, the bodies were flown to the hospital ship and kept in the mortuary until they could be repatriated back home. The second incident I just want to briefly touch upon involved the Atlantic Conveyor. This is our sort of floating Waitrose. Every so often we would have a RAS at sea, which means replenishment at sea, when she would sail in parallel with us at a reduced speed and extend a large boom across, transferring fuel and stores and munitions. As the Argentinians were keen to sink the two carriers, if they had, the war would have been over before it started. However, that day the Argentinians had sunk HMS Coventry, killing 19 sailors and injuring others. Sinking this outer protection ship would have made the Argentinians aware that the two carriers were somewhere in that space ahead of them. So they sent out more reconnaissance planes, which again were fitted with exercise missiles. One of the planes picked up a large blip on the radar screen, and assuming it was one of the carriers, launched 3 missiles. the Atlantic Conveyor was hit on the 25th of May 1982, killing a number of sailors of the Merchant Navy. Given the amount of fuel she was carrying, it was not long before she was a burning inferno. Some of the crew were so panic-stricken to get off the blazing ship that they did not put on their immersion suits properly, which was to ensure that there was no air trapped inside. These suits, by today's standard, were very basic indeed. As soon as they hit the water, the current swept them away because the ship, by its momentum, was still moving. Sadly, the air inside the immersion suits moved upwards, inverting the person so that their 2 feet stuck in the air with their chest and their head under the water. They drowned. One rather rotund and bald man had jumped into the sea only wearing a life jacket rather than being faced with being burnt to death. One of our helicopters retrieved his body. I recall when I went down to the sick bay that the doctor said that given his overall weight and size, when he hit the freezing water, he probably died instantly of a heart attack. He also pointed out on the palm of the victim's right hand there was an unusual tattoo. It was an anchor with a heart in its centre, and in the heart was a letter J. That evening I was allowed 4 minutes to conduct a very brief committal service. It was a dark, cloudy night. The captain allowed me, as I said, 4 minutes, travelling at a speed of 3 knots. The reason was the threat of submarines if we remained too long in one place at going a slow speed. As the weighted body entered the sea, the clouds parted and a beam of light shone right across the water to where the body had entered. Even the most cynically hardened sailor was emotionally taken aback. The conflict ended with the Argentinian surrender on the 14th of June. Job complete, we returned once again to the British. We returned the island once again to British control. And then we headed north, back home. A few days later, I held a brief sunset ceremony to remember all those who perished. As the sun slowly disappeared under the horizon, a Royal Marine bugler from the bridge wing sounded the last post. A most moving and poignant occasion. On a return to Portsmouth, there was thousands of families along the river bank. Only the families and children of the crew were allowed on the jetty. As the ship came alongside, I recall the comments of the older officer to the younger officer, "What makes you think you'll be coming back?" I pondered sadly of the mothers, wives and children who would not get a kiss or a cuddle from their loved ones who never come back. We were keen to quickly get ashore. Then we were told that we had to meet a group of very senior naval admirals and Air Force officers headed by the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher, she asked me what I thought of my experience. My response was that freedom comes at a very high price for sailors and their loved ones. Then we were allowed ashore to meet our loved ones. Months later, there was a memorial service held in St. Paul's Cathedral. After the service, everyone was invited down to the crypt for tea and coffee and sandwiches. I was in full naval uniform. As you can imagine, the place was absolutely crowded, and it made it very difficult holding a cup of tea in one hand and a plate of sandwiches in the other. However, I did notice in the distance, under an alcove, an empty seat, and I promptly headed for it. I sat down beside a lady who was clearly on her own. After a little while, I introduced myself. She said her name was Jane. I asked if she had someone serving in the Royal Navy. She said no, that her husband had been in the Merchant Navy, but he had not come home. He had been on the Atlantic Conveyor. Her eyes watered up, and she started wringing her hands in anguish. Then I noticed on the palm of her right hand a tattoo of an anchor, a heart, and an initial C. After a few moments of silence, I quietly asked her what was her late husband's name. Still with the tears rolling down her cheeks, she said, Colin. Not sure what to do, I then asked if her husband was a tall man, an athletic, like many sailors. She said no, he was very fat and bald. I then revealed to her what had happened. After I had finished, there was long pauses and many, many tears. And she held both my hands and said, thank you from the bottom of my heart. She had always believed that her husband had been burned to death in the flames. Now knowing what really happened to her beloved husband, plus the very brief Christian committal service, she said she could now get on with life. What statistically were the odds of me sitting beside that one lady, given the thousands attending St. Paul's Cathedral? God does indeed work in mysterious ways. We shall grow, not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. We shall now hear the Royal Naval, the Navy's almost own hymn, Eternal Father, strong to save.
Restless Why do you still grieve, old man, for those friends you laid to rest? Why do your eyes gleam, old man, when you hear those bubbles blow? Tell me why you cry, old man, about those days so long ago.
I'll tell you why I march, young girl, with medals on my chest. I'll tell you why I grieve, younger, for those I laid to rest. Through misty fields of gossamer silk came visions of distant times, when boys of tender age lost lives, and all their mothers cried. We buried them in blankets shrouded, their flesh scorched and blackened, a communal grave newly gouged in blood-stained gorse and bracken. You ask me why I march, young girl. I march to remind you all that but for those apple blossom years, you'd never known freedom at all.
I'll tell you why I'm grateful, old man, for what you had to say, for reminding me of the cost they paid in securing my freedom this day. Inscribed upon this book are names of people I've never met. I carry the book with gratitude that I may never forget. So let us walk together now with memories old and new, with gratitude and thankfulness for those we never knew.
Before I sign off, sail off and head to the sunset, I would like to thank the rest of the crew who helped me present these services over the past year. Derek Clark, Scottish Opera, choirmaster, organist, for his help in providing introits, the anthems and the music. Richard Hassel, choir member, reader. I can remember Richard coming to our garden room, hail, rain or shine. And Gordon Whitelaw for helping to keep my printer in operation. Otherwise there'd be no sermon. And finally, and lastly, Emily, my first mate, who has produced these presentations over the past year. To her goes my undoubted thanks.